Hello, this is Chuck Stull, continuing our discussion of the telephone industry and looking at cell phones. Now, the history of the cell phone perhaps goes back to 1946 when Motorola introduced radio phones that weighed 80 pounds. During the 1960s and 70s, Bell Labs continued to develop the radio phone technology. In the 70s, they requested approval to offer mobile service, but the Federal Communications Commission was very slow to approve. They did eventually approve it during the breakup in the 1980s and allowed AT&T to offer cell service. Now, in 1984, after the breakup, AT&T cell service was distributed to the regional Bell operating companies, to the Baby Bells, and it was seen as a small, unimportant part of the telephone business. Mobile phone technology, by definition, are not wired. Cell phones use radio waves to communicate to cell towers. And so they're looking at using a particular part of the radio frequency spectrum, and spectrum turns out to be an important component of the cell phone industry and cell phone technology. So cell phones communicate by radio waves to cell towers. The cell phones have a limited range, so towers need to be reasonably close, perhaps within a mile or two. Now, in the open countryside, perhaps you can have a little bit longer reach. And in a dense city where there's interference from lots of buildings, the cell towers typically are much closer, perhaps a few hundred meters apart. Now, each antenna has limited capacity on the tower. At our current generation, someplace between 30 and 60 users. So many towers will have multiple antennae. But still, we have a lot of towers in the United States, over 300,000 towers, and those numbers have been growing substantially over time. Now, the cell towers connect to the regular phone system, either using copper wires or fiber optic cables. So the tower receives a signal from the cell phone and converts that to the standard system for the standard signal for the phone system, where it's then transmitted by cable to whatever its destination is, either directly by landline or perhaps retranslated and reconnected by radio waves at the other end if it is a cell-to-cell communication. Now, the FCC, after the breakup of AT&T, did want to create a competitive market for mobile phone service. This was not seen as a natural monopoly at all. We didn't have that hardwiring required. And so the FCC intentionally distributed spectrum in a way to try and create new competitors. Now, in the 1980s, the spectrum was given away free by lottery, and lottery winners were free to resell it. By the 1990s, the FCC had turned to an auction where participants could purchase cell phone spectrum in particular geographic markets by being the highest bidder. And there were many participants in these markets, the regional Bell operating companies, Sprint, MCI, brand new entrants like Macau Cellular, who were becoming new breakouts or new entries who were breaking into the cell market. Now, as a result of this, cell service prices dropped substantially, and there became ubiquitous use of cell phones, right? Lower prices, higher quantities. If we look at the cell phone industry structure, initially we had fairly strong competition, certainly much stronger than we ever saw in landline telephones. There were 6 national firms plus many regional firms competing, and then resellers who would be using someone else's system but setting their own prices and their own branding. Now, there were a whole series of complex mergers, and the industry became much more concentrated. If we look at the period 1999 to 2006, we can see the 3-firm concentration ratio went from less than 40% up to 80%. right, leaving us with really four major national providers: AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. Um, so Verizon, we've talked about. Verizon was formed by the merger of two Baby Bells, plus they acquired some other companies. The new AT&T, which was the rest of the Baby Bells merged together, as well as the dying remnants of the original AT&T, plus some other purchases. The T-Mobile we haven't mentioned. This is a descendant of some of the new entrants from the 80s and 90s, particularly on the West Coast. Um, and it was bought by the German telephone company Deutsche Telekom and was a wholly owned subsidiary. Sprint, we also mentioned earlier, this was originally Brown Telephone, operating in rural Kansas as one of the few independent phone companies. It was an early long-distance competitor to the original AT&T, and through a series of mergers and purchasing um, cellular spectrum, became a reasonably sized player in this market. U.S. Cellular would be the next biggest company. This again was an entrant from the 80s when the policy was to try and create new competitors. And it is a relatively small player with just around 1% of the national market share. If we look at market shares, um, Verizon in fall of 2018 had a 35% market share, AT&T 34%, T-Mobile 18%, Sprint 12%. That gives us a three-firm concentration ratio of 87, so even higher than the previous number. And the four-firm concentration ratio, right, our traditional one, would be 99%. It's a very concentrated industry. Now, technology continued to develop, continued to change throughout this time period. Mobile phones were initially limited to voice, and obviously they have much more now. The development and adoption of smartphones were also very rapid, and you can see in about a 10-year period growing from almost nothing to nearly 80% of the mobile phone market in the US. So we have seen several generations of the mobile phone markets or mobile phone technologies. Each of them required lots of invention and lots of investment in specific network equipment. Let me look at the four generations we've had and the one that is about to be introduced. So first generation cell phones were voice only. These were analog as opposed to digital, and these ran through the 1980s. The second generation were the first digital first digital cell phones, introduced in 1990 and running really through the 1990s. So these again were mainly voice, but we also had messages and SMS services. 3G was introduced in 2001 and it is still in use, although not the dominant technology. This allowed data and connection to the internet. Fourth generation we typically see as LTE, introduced in 2010. This is still our main high-speed cell service now, so faster than 3G, allowing video, more internet surfing, video phone calls, and so forth. Now the next generation is still to come, being rolled out this year in 2020. This will be faster, have higher capacity, and will allow some things that they're really beyond what we're discussing right now in terms of cell phones, but supporting the Internet of Things, looking at the connected autonomous vehicles we mentioned in the auto industry, smart cities, and so forth. Now, each of these generations has required a new network and new telephones. So when the fifth generation network is rolled out, it is likely you will need a new telephone in order to connect to it. Usually the equipment is backwards compatible so that the new phones can also use the old networks when the new network isn't available. Let me turn to structural change in the modern telephone era. And let me start with a really well-known merger case from 2011. This was AT&T and T-Mobile. So the industry was already highly concentrated. But AT&T, again, this is the new AT&T formed by SBC gobbling up all the other baby bells. That AT&T had a history of getting regulatory approval for mergers that looked like they would um, not pass muster for antitrust grounds. In March of 2011, they made a $39 billion offer to Deutsche Telekom, T-Mobile's owner, to purchase T-Mobile. In August, the Department of Justice filed suit to try and block the merger between AT&T and T-Mobile, saying it would be anti-competitive, and the deal at that point fell through. AT&T ended up paying a $3 billion penalty to T-Mobile that had been put in the contract because T-Mobile did have antitrust concerns, and they also were required to give wireless spectrum worth billions of dollars more to T-Mobile. Now that didn't completely put AT&T off of its appetite for mergers. There was a smaller deal in 2014, and this is AT&T wanted to purchase Leap Wireless, better known for its brand name Cricket. Now, the FCC expressed concern about the reduction in competition, but they did believe that this merger would allow the new technology at that time, which was the LTE, right, or 4G, fourth generation technology, would be expanded through this merger. And this was seen as a relatively small merger. It was only a $1.2 billion deal, and the FCC did approve it, and the Department of Justice did not oppose this on antitrust grounds. That brings us to our most recent telephone merger, which was the T-Mobile Sprint merger. And this ran from 2018 to spring of this year, spring of 2020. So T-Mobile proposed to acquire Sprint in April of 2018 for a sum of $26.5 billion. There was a full year of hearings from the Federal Communications Commission and the U.S. Congress, and there were states that filed lawsuits to block this merger in 2019, and the Department of Justice put forth a complaint saying that this merger would extinguish substantial competition in the industry. They said it would be a probable violation of Section 7 of the Clayton Act, that the combined companies would have an incentive and ability to raise prices, and that the remaining three firms in the industry would be able to better coordinate, hurting the consumer. The Department of Justice also said there was an absence of countervailing factors. Remember, mergers are judged under the rule of reason. They weigh cost and benefits, and at that time, the Department of Justice saw very few benefits going to consumers or going to society from this merger. So then followed a period of negotiation and resulted in what was called the proposed final judgment. And this was that Sprint divest itself of some of its brands like Boost Mobile and Virgin Mobile, cell sites and Spectrum, their retailers for Boost and Virgin, and that they would lease the network to a new competitor. Now, this was not a new company, but this was the Dish Network agreed to purchase those wireless assets in order to become a new competitor in cell phones. So Dish agreed to buy Boost and Virgin Mobile for $1.4 billion, plus they paid $3.6 billion for some of the associated spectrum. And the antitrust authorities then saw, well, we have a new competitor. They thought a merger of the third and fourth largest companies would make a bigger, more efficient competitor and perhaps provide more effective competition to the larger Verizon and AT&T. And they again were convinced that technology advances could be more if this merger took place, particularly because T-Mobile had promised to get the 5G network to 97% of the population within 3 years, 99% of the population within 6 years, and then specific targets for rural areas. And that merger, after all of those divestitures and promises were made, the merger was approved with a 5 to 7 year oversight by the Department of Justice to make sure the promises were fulfilled. And the consumption of the merger happened just in April of 2020 after this class started. So this is an industry where technology continues to advance, and there are many questions about what the future will look like. Certainly one of the things that's on many people's minds now is how fast will the 5G network be implemented in the United States. There's been a dispute with China, both over trade and concerns about national security, and will the US block use of technology from the Chinese company Huawei? If it does, it may put the US behind European countries in adoption of 5G. And of course, the coronavirus is slowing many decisions and adding lots of uncertainty to this business as it is to others. This has been Chuck Stull looking at the cell phone section of the telecommunications industry, coming to you from Kalamazoo College. Thank you for listening.